Welcome back from New York City. I'm on the road again now. I have been here for about a day already. What a day it has been. I arrived here late Monday night, and the hotel check-in didn't, it closed at 12, so I figured I wouldn't have any time to get into the hostel in time. So I opted for sleeping at the airport, which was a bad idea in hindsight, because while I was sleeping, someone stole my phone. And the problem is I had my vaccination pass on my phone, and I needed that to get into my hostel and to travel onwards when I'm done here, which is in about 2 days. So I had to search the city for a cheap replacement. I went to 3 different Best Buys, and at the third one I finally found one for $2.29. And right as I was leaving the store, a guy was stabbed right at the exit. If you want to stay in New York on a budget, there are some things you should know. The first part is when to go to New York. I mean, most people will probably want to go during the summer or the holidays, but those are also the most expensive times to visit, just because, many people want to go here then. So, if you want to save money, the best way is to go during the off-season, which is primarily January or February, which is right now when I'm here. But if you still want to visit during the summer and the holidays, you can expect a little bit of higher prices. There are also 4 things you're going to be spending money on. That's accommodation, food, transport, and attractions. And firstly, accommodation. I would recommend getting a hostel. I know you're going to be sleeping in a room with other people, but you're going to be saving a lot of money too. The hostel I stayed at cost me $30 a night. It was 500 meters from Central Park, and it had 8 out of 10 on booking.com, so it was a pretty good deal. It was also the cheapest accommodation in the entire city when I booked. Now, if you want to stay in a hotel, that will of course be more expensive, but you can check other places than Manhattan, like Brooklyn or Queens, for example. You might save $100 a night on a hotel if you book in those places, and the money you spend on transportation to get into Manhattan won't be as much. So it will definitely be worth it to check further out from the city. You can even check in New Jersey, because it's so close to the city. And I'll also recommend getting an Airbnb, because it can be cheaper than even a hostel sometimes. So check that. And if you absolutely don't want to spend any money at all on accommodation, then you should do Couchsurfing, which basically means you sleep on somebody's couch. And it can be pretty hard to get a host in New York City. I mean, you're basically getting free accommodation, and it's also supposed to be like a cultural exchange program kind of thing. But if you manage to find a host, then you can save a lot of money that way. Okay, moving on to transportation. You're gonna have to get to the city somehow, and you're probably gonna be flying. Now, when's the best time to fly? Off season. It's like with the accommodation. So January and February are the cheapest times. If you book really far ahead, you can get some really good deals. The cheapest I've seen from Stockholm to New York is about 150 euros. And that's a really good price. And transportation within the city, you should probably get a 1-week unlimited access card for the metro, which you can also use for the buses. It costs about $30, and that's about 10 single ride tickets, so you get a really good deal for that. I wouldn't recommend getting a cab, because it's really expensive, and yeah, I mean, it's more of a tourist attraction, basically. Which, while the metro is a tourist attraction too, but it's not an expensive tourist attraction. And if you really want to get a cab somewhere, I'll recommend using an Uber or something like that, because you'll save maybe like half the money on the ride. Moving on to food. The great thing about New York is that you don't have to spend a lot of money to experience the local cuisine, because I mean, you could just go to McDonald's. That's American cuisine, and it's a little bit more expensive than most places, but I mean, it's cheaper than going to a real restaurant. And there are also other alternatives for cheap food. I mean, in Manhattan there's a lot of places that sell $1 sliced pizzas, which is great for a lunch or breakfast. And you can also go to a street vendor or a bodega and get some cheap food. So, unless you plan on dining out, then food won't be that expensive in New York, actually. And now, finally, for the attractions, the reason you come to New York City. How do you save money on them? Well, many of them you can actually visit for free. For example, the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty ferry costs about $25, I think. But you can also take the Staten Island ferry for free, which goes right past the statue. So that's $25 saved. And some other things like museums. Many of them are pay what you wish, or they even have free days. So if you plan ahead accordingly, you can visit all the museums you want for free. Now, the one thing that costs money that you can't really save money on is the observation decks. I mean, there are several, like the One World Trade Center, the Edge, or Top of the Rock and Rockefeller Center, which I would recommend. And these are about around $40 each, which isn't that much. I think you should spend money on that. But there are also tourist cards you can buy, which includes lots of attractions, including often one of the observation decks. So if you really want to spend money on attractions, then I would recommend getting one of those. But if you want a good view of the city, I recommend going over the Brooklyn Bridge to Brooklyn Heights, especially during the night, because then you'll get a really good view of lower Manhattan. And if you really don't want to spend money on an observation deck, then that is a good way to get a view of the skyline. To conclude this video, I wanted to give some of my final thoughts on New York and the US as a whole. Before coming to the US, I had this image of the country as a place full of poverty and crime. When I planned my trip to New York, I was hoping that my presumptions would be proven false, but sadly they were not. Like I mentioned earlier, within the first few hours in the country, I had really bad luck and got my phone stolen. As I was buying a replacement at Best Buy, I witnessed a stabbing. The city itself feels like something out of a science fiction dystopia, such as Blade Runner or the Hunger Games. There are huge skyscrapers covered in glass, housing the world's largest corporations and being home to the world's richest and most powerful people. Yet, down on the streets, there are homeless people, many of them being veterans who risk their lives serving in the military. Once you go out to the other boroughs, mainly the Bronx or Queens, it feels more like you're in a suburb in the Balkans than in the Big Apple. When you're walking along the trash-filled streets among the rundown buildings, the skyscrapers over in Manhattan start to feel like an insult to the working people who receive none of the wealth and riches that the city itself is famous for. I'm glad to have visited the city and to have seen many different parts of it, including all the 5 boroughs, and to have met some wonderful people, but I can definitely say that I would never want to live in the city.